Tragedy at Ravensthorpe. By JJ Connington. New York. Grosset and Dunlap. Published February 1928. Chapter 1. The Fairy Houses. Got fixed up in your new house yet, Sir Clinton? Asked Cecil Chasewater, as they sauntered together up one of the paths in the Ravensthorpe grounds. It must be a bit of a change from South Africa, settling down in this backwater. Sir Clinton Driffield, the new chief constable of the county, nodded affirmatively in reply to the question. One manages to be fairly comfortable, and it's certainly been less trouble to fit up than it would have been if I'd taken a bigger place. Not that I don't envy you people at Ravensthorpe, he added, glancing round at the long front of the house behind him. You've plenty of elbow room in that castle of yours. Cecil made no reply, and they paced on for a minute or more before Sir Clinton again spoke. It's a curious thing, Cecil, that although I knew your father so well, I never happened to come down here to Ravensthorpe. He often asked me to stay, and I wanted to see his collection, but somehow we never seemed able to fix on a time that suited us both. It was at the house in Onslow Square that I always saw you, so this is all fresh ground to me. It's rather like the irony of fate that my first post since I came home should be in the very district I couldn't find time to visit when your father was alive. Cecil Chasewater agreed with a gesture. I was very glad when I saw you'd been appointed. I wondered if you'd know me again after all that time, but I thought we'd better bring ourselves to your notice in case we could be of any help here, introduce you to people, and all that sort of thing, you know. I hardly recognized you when you turned up the other day, Sir Clinton admitted frankly. You were a kiddie when I went off to take that police post in South Africa, and somehow or other I never seemed to have run across you on any of my trips home on leave. It must have been 10 years since I'd seen you. I don't wonder you didn't place me at once. 10 years makes a lot of difference at my advanced age. But you don't look a bit changed. I recognized you straight off, as soon as I saw you. What age are you now? Asked Sir Clinton. About 23, Cecil replied. Maurice is 25, and Jones just on the edge of 21. I suppose she must be, Sir Clinton confirmed. A thought seemed to cross his mind. By the way, this masked ball, I take it, is for Jones' coming of age. You got an invitation? Right. I've nothing to do with that part of the business. Then, answering Sir Clinton's inquiry, yes, that's so. She wanted a spree of some sort, and she generally gets what she wants, you know. You'll hardly know her when you see her. She's shot up out of all recognition from the kid you knew before you went away. She used to be pretty as a schoolgirl. Oh, she hasn't fallen off in that direction. You must come to this show of hers. She'll be awfully pleased if you do. She looks on you as a kind of unofficial uncle, you know. Sir Clinton's expression showed that he appreciated the indirect compliment. I'm highly flattered. She's the only one of you who took the trouble to write to me from time to time when I was out yonder. All my Ravensthorpe news came through her. Cecil was rather discomfited by this reminder. He changed the subject abruptly. I suppose you'll come as Sherlock Holmes? Jones laid down that everyone must act up to their costume, whatever it is, and Sherlock wouldn't give you much trouble after all your detective experience. You'd only have to snoop round and pick up clues and make people uncomfortable with deductions. Sir Clinton seemed amused by the idea. A pretty program. Something like this, I suppose, he demanded, and gave a faintly caricatured imitation of the Holmes mannerisms. By Jove, you know, that's awfully good. Cecil commented, rather taken aback by the complete change in Sir Clinton's voice and gait. You ought to do it. You'd get first prize easily. Sir Clinton shook his head as he resumed his natural guise. The mask wouldn't cover my moustache, and I draw the line at shaving that off, even in a good cause. Besides, a chief constable can't go running about disguised as Sherlock Holmes. Rather bad taste, dragging one's trade into one's amusements. No, I'll come as something quite unostentatious. A pillar box or an invisible man, or a spook, probably. I forgot, Cecil hastened to say, apologetically, I shouldn't have asked you about your costume. Joan's very strong on some fancy regulation she's made that no one is to know beforehand what anyone else is wearing. She wants the prize awarding to be absolutely unbiased. So you'd better not tell me what you're going to do. Sir Clinton glanced at him with a faint twinkle in his eye. That's precisely what I've been doing for the last minute or two, he said, dryly. What do you mean? Cecil asked, looking puzzled. You haven't told me anything. Exactly. Cecil was forced to smile. No harm done, he admitted. You gave nothing away. It's a very useful habit in my line of business. But Sir Clinton's interest in the approaching masked ball was apparently not yet exhausted. Large crowd coming? He asked. Fairish, I believe. Most of the neighbors, I suppose. We're putting up a few people for the night, of course, and there are 3 or 4 visitors on the premises already. It should be quite a decent show. I can't give you even rough numbers, for Joan's taken the invitation side of the thing entirely into her own hands. Most mysterious about it, too. Hush. Hush. Very secret. And all that kind of thing. She won't even let us see her lists for fear of making it too easy to recognize people, so she's had to arrange the catering side of the thing on her own as well. She always was an independent kind of person, Sir Clinton volunteered. Cecil took no notice of the interjection. If you ask me, he went on, I think she's a bit besotted with this incognito notion. She doesn't realize that half the gang can be spotted at once by their walk, and the other half will give themselves away as soon as they get animated and begin to jabber freely. But it's her show, you know, so it's no use anyone else butting in with criticisms and spoiling her fun before it begins. Sir Clinton nodded his assent, but for a moment or two he seemed to be preoccupied with some line of thought which Cecil's words had started in his mind. Suddenly, however, something caught his eye and diverted his attention to external things. What's that weird thing over there? He asked. As he spoke, he pointed to an object a little way off the path on which they were standing. It was a tiny building about a yard in height and a couple of yards or more in length. At the first glance it seemed like a bungalow reduced to the scale of a large doll's house, but closer inspection showed that it was windowless, though ventilation of a sort appeared to have been provided. A miniature door closed the entrance, through which a full-grown man could gain admittance only by lying flat on the ground and wriggling with some difficulty through the narrow opening provided. That. Cecil answered carelessly. Oh, that's one of the fairy houses, you know. They're a sort of local curiosity. No matter where you are, you'll find one of them within a couple of 100 yards of you, anywhere in the grounds. Only in the grounds? Aren't there any outside the estate? Inquired Sir Clinton. At the first glance I took it for some sort of archaeological affair. They're old enough, I dare say, Cecil admitted, indifferently. A century, or a century and a half, or perhaps even more. They're purely a Ravensthorpe product. I've never seen one of them outside the boundary. Sir Clinton left the path and made a closer examination of the tiny hut, but it presented very few points of interest in itself. Out of curiosity, he turned the handle of the door and found it moved easily. You seem to keep the locks and hinges oiled, he said, with some surprise. Pushing the door open, he stooped down and glanced inside. Very spick and span. You keep them in good repair, evidently. Oh, one of the gardeners has the job of looking after them, Cecil explained, without showing much interest. I've never seen anything of the sort before. They might be Picts' dwellings, or something of that kind. But why keep them in repair? And, of course, they're not prehistoric at all. They're comparatively modern, from the way they're put together. What are they? Ask me another, said Cecil, who seemed bored by the subject. They're an ancestral legacy, or an heirloom, or a tenant's improvement, or whatever you like to call it. Clause in the will each time, to provide for them being kept in good repair, and so forth. Sir Clinton seemed to prick up his ears when he heard of this provision, though his tone showed only languid interest when he put his next inquiry. Anything at the back of it all? It seems a rum sort of business. The country people round about here will supply you with all the information you can believe about it, and a lot you're not likely to swallow, too. By their way of it, Lavington Knoll up there, he pointed vaguely to indicate its position, was the last of the fairy strongholds hereabouts, and when most of the fairies went away, a few stayed behind. But these didn't care much for the old knoll after that. Reminded them of past glories and cheery company too much, I suppose, and so they made a sort of treaty with an ancestor of ours. He was to provide houses for them, and they were to look after the general prosperity side of Ravensthorpe. Sir Clinton seemed amused by Cecil's somewhat scornful summary. A case of farewell rewards and fairies, it seems, Cecil. Then, half to himself, he hummed a few lines of Corbett's song. Witness those rings and roundelays of theirs, which yet remain, were footed in Queen Marie's days, on many a grassy plain, but since of late Elizabeth. Do you go as far back as Elizabeth, here at Ravensthorpe, by any chance, Cecil? So far as the grounds go, yes. The house was partly destroyed in Cromwell's time, and some new bits were built on in place of the old stuff. But there's a lot of the old part left yet, in quite good repair. Sir Clinton still seemed interested in the compact with the fairies. Was there any penalty clause in the contract about these houses? There's usually some drawback to these affairs, like the Luck of Eden Hall, for instance. There used to be some legend or other that unless the fairies found their houses always in good order, the family curse would come home to roost, one time. No one believes in that sort of stuff nowadays, but it's kept alive by this clause that's put into every will, a kind of a family custom, you know, that no one cares to be the first to break. If you call it a damned old wives' tale, I shan't blame you. Sir Clinton could not be sure whether Cecil's indifference in the matter was natural or assumed, but in any case he thought it tactful to pursue the subject no further. Closing the door of the fairy house again, he made his way back to the path where his companion was waiting for him. As the chief constable rejoined him, Cecil looked round the horizon with feeble interest. "Not much else to show you, I'm afraid," he said. Then, with an afterthought, "Care to see rather good view? The best one hereabouts is just up above us, through the wood here, if you think it worth the trouble of the climb. It's not very far. We've plenty of time before lunch." Sir Clinton acquiesced, and they began to mount a further slope in the path which now led them up through a sparse pinewood. "There seems to be a good sound foundation to this path," the chief constable commented, as they walked on. "There used to be a carriage drive, at one time, leading up to the top. I suppose the old birds used to drive up here and sit out having tea and admiring the view on fine days. But it's been neglected for long enough. Hardly anyone goes up to the top now, except once in a blue moon or else by accident." Sir Clinton gave a nod of acquiescence. "Anyone can see the path's hardly ever used." "Just beyond this brow," Cecil explained as they moved on, "there's an old quarry cut in the further side of the hill. It's a very old place, rather picturesque nowadays. Most of the stone for Ravensthorpe came from it in the old days, and during the rebuilding. After that, the quarry dropped out of use gradually, and finally someone had the notion of letting water in at the foot of it and having a sort of model lake there, with the cliff of the quarry at one end of it. We're making for the top of the cliff by going this way, and when you get out of the wood into the open, you'll find rather good outlook over the country." A short walk took them through the rest of the pinewood. On the further side they came into a belt of open ground beyond which, on a slight eminence, a little spinney blocked part of the view. "That's where we're making for," Cecil explained. "The best viewpoint is on the other side of these trees. The old birds, a century back, chose it carefully and did some laying out at the top, so I suppose they must have been keen on the place." As they approached the spinney, Sir Clinton noticed a fence running down from each side of it. Cecil followed the direction of the chief constable's glance. "That's barbed wire," he pointed out. "The spinney's at the top of the quarry, but there's a bad drop down towards the hollow on either side, a dangerous bit, practically precipitous, and so the wire was put up to prevent anyone wandering near the edge and tripping over." Cutting through the fringe of trees, they emerged at the top of the cliff. Here the ground had been leveled and paved. Along the precipice, a marble balustrade had been erected as a safeguard. Further back, a curved tier of marble seats faced the view, and here and there in the line rose pedestals carrying life-sized marble statues which faced out towards the gulf. "This is really very elaborate," Sir Clinton commented. "Evidently your ancestors liked the view, if they took so much trouble to put up this affair." He moved across the paved space, leaned on the balustrade, and looked down into the depths. "I don't wonder you fenced that in with barbed wire on each side," he said. "It's a nasty drop down there, well over 50-foot fall at least." "It's nearer 100, really," Cecil corrected him. "The height's a bit deceptive from here. And a fall into that pool would be no joy, I can tell you. It's full of sharp spikes of rock jutting up from the bottom. You'd get fairly well mauled if you happened to drop on any of them. You can't see them for that green stuff in the water, but they're all present and correct under the surface." Sir Clinton looked down at the weed-grown little lakelet. The dense green fronds gave the water an unpleasant appearance, and in some tiny backwaters the surface was covered with a layer of scum. "Why don't you get all that stuff cleared out?" he demanded. "It looks rather beastly. Once you got rid of it you could stock the pool with trout or perch, easily enough. I see there's some flow of water through it from a spring at the east end." Cecil seemed to have no interest in the suggestion. "If you want some fishing," he said, "we've got quite a decent stream that runs through another part of the grounds. This place used to be kept in good order, but since the war and all that, you know, The fine edge has been rather off things hereabouts. It's in a bad state, right enough. Just a frog pond. Is the water deep? Sir Clinton inquired. Oh, 10 to 15 feet in parts. Quite deep just in front of the cave at the bottom of the cliff below here. We used to have great times playing robbers and so forth when we were kids. There's our old raft at the far end. It was well tarred and I see it still afloat. It was the only way of getting at the cave mouth, you see. He dismissed the subject. Suppose we sit down for a while. Sir Clinton followed him to one of the marble benches. Before them, the view of the Ravensthorpe ground stretched out, closed on the horizon by a line of woodland. In the foreground, beyond a fence at the end of the lake, sheep were grazing on some meadowland. One of your ancestors? Inquired Sir Clinton, nodding towards the nearest statue. Or merely Phoebus Apollo? Cecil turned to glance at the statue. I think I'd back your second choice, he said. If it was an ancestor, it must have been one of the ancient Britons. It's a bit short of clothes for anything later than that, and even for an ancient Briton it seems a trifle undressed. No woad, you know. He took out his cigarette case, offered it to Sir Clinton, and then began to smoke. Sir Clinton seemed to be admiring the view in front of him for a few minutes, but when he spoke again it was evident that something more than scenery had been in his mind. I'm not altogether easy in my mind over this masked ball of Jones. Speaking as a chief constable responsible for the good behaviour of the district, Cecil, it seems to me that you're running some risks over it. A dance is all very well. You know all your guests by headmark and no one can get in on false pretenses. But once you start masks, it's a different state of affairs altogether. Cecil made no comment, and Sir Clinton smoked in silence for a time before continuing. It's this craze of Jones for anonymity that seems to me to open the door to all sorts of things. I take it that there'll be no announcing of individual guests, because of this incognito stunt of hers. But unfortunately that means you'll have to admit anyone who chooses to present himself as Winnie the Pooh or Felix the Cat or Father Christmas. You don't know who he is. You can't inquire at the start. Anybody might get in. Considering the amount of good portable stuff there is in the collection at Ravensthorpe, do you think it's quite desirable to have no check whatever on your guests? Cecil seemed struck by this view of the case. I never thought of that, he said. I suppose we ought to have issued uniform entrance tickets, or something of that sort, but the thing never crossed any of our minds. Somehow, it seems a bit steep to take precautions against people when one's inviting them to one's house. It's not invited guests I'm thinking about, Sir Clinton hastened to explain more definitely. This affair must have been talked about all over the countryside. What's to hinder some enterprising thief dressing up as a tramp and presenting himself along with the rest? He'd get in all right. And once he was inside, he might be tempted to forget the laws of hospitality and help himself. Then, if he made himself scarce before the unmasking at midnight, he'd get clean away and leave no trace. See it? Cecil nodded affirmatively, but to Sir Clinton's slight surprise he did not appear to be much perturbed on the subject. The chief constable seemed to see an explanation of this attitude. Perhaps, of course, you're shutting up the collections for the evening. Cecil shook his head. No. Joan insists on having them on view, all of them. It's a state occasion for her, you know, and she's determined to have all the best of Ravensthorpe for her guests. What she says goes, you know. If she can't get her own way by one road she takes another. It's always easier to give in to her at once and be done with it. She has such a way of making one feel a beast if one refuses her anything, and yet she never seems to get spoiled with it all. Sir Clinton seemed rather taken aback by the news about the collections. Well, it's your funeral, not mine, if anything does happen, he admitted. Maurice's, not mine, Cecil corrected him with a touch of bitterness which Sir Clinton failed to understand at the moment. I've nothing to do with Ravensthorpe nowadays, Cecil went on, after a pause. I live there, that's all. The whole affair went to Maurice, lock, stock, and barrel, when my father died. I've really no more right in these grounds than you have. I might be kicked out any day. Sir Clinton was puzzled by Cecil's tone. It was only natural that Ravensthorpe should go down into the hands of Maurice, since he was the elder brother. There could be no particular grievance in that. And yet Cecil's voice had betrayed something deeper than a mere mild resentment. The asperity in his last remark had been unmistakable. For a few minutes Cecil remained silent, staring moodily out at the landscape. Sir Clinton refrained from interrupting his thoughts. The matter certainly had excited his curiosity, but until Cecil chose to say more, there seemed to be no reason for intruding into the private affairs of the Ravensthorpe household. Even the privileges of an old friend did not seem to Sir Clinton a sufficient excuse for probing into family matters. But the chief constable, without any voluntary effort, had the gift of eliciting confidences without soliciting them. Cecil's brooding came to an end and he turned round to face his companion. "I suppose I've said either too much or too little already," he began. "I don't see why I shouldn't tell you about the affair. It's nearly common talk as it is, and you're sure to hear something about it sooner or later. You may as well get it firsthand and be done with it." Sir Clinton, having solicited no confidence, contented himself with merely listening, without offering any vocal encouragement. "You knew my father well," Cecil went on, after a short pause in which he seemed to be arranging his ideas in some definite order. "He was one of the best, if you like. No one would say a word against him. It's the last thing I'd think of doing myself, at any rate." Sir Clinton nodded approvingly. "The bother was," Cecil continued, "that he judged every one by himself. He couldn't understand that anyone might not be as straight as he always was. He never made an allowance for some kinds of human nature, if you see what I mean. And, another thing, he had a great notion of the duties of the head of the family. He took them pretty seriously and he looked after a lot of people who had no claim on him, really, except that they belonged to the clan. He was always generous, I know," Sir Clinton confirmed. "And he always trusted people. Sometimes, perhaps, he overdid it." Cecil made a gesture of agreement and continued. "He overdid it when he drew up his will. Maurice, of course, was bound to be the next head of the family, once my father had gone, so my father took it for granted that things would go on just the same. The head of the family would run the show with an eye to the interests of the rest of us, and all would be right on the night. That was the theory of the business, as my father saw it, and he drafted his will on that basis." Cecil sat up suddenly and flung away his cigarette with a vehemence which betrayed the heat of his feelings. "That was the theory of the business, as I said. But the practice wasn't quite so satisfactory. My father left every penny he had to Maurice. He left him absolutely every asset. And, of course, Ravensthorpe's entailed, so Maurice got that in the normal course. Joan, my mother, and myself were left without a farthing to bless ourselves with. But there was a suggestion in the will, not a legally binding thing, but merely a sort of informal direction, that Maurice was to look after us all and give us some sort of income each. I suppose my father hardly thought it worth while to do more than that. Being the sort of man he was, he would rely implicitly on Maurice playing the game, just as he'd have played the game himself, had played it all his life, you know." Sir Clinton showed no desire to offer any comment, and in a moment or two Cecil went on once more. "Last year, there was nothing to complain about. Maurice footed our bills quite decently. He never grumbled over our expenses. Everything seemed quite sound. It never crossed my mind to get things put on a business footing. In fact, you know, I'd hardly have had the nerve to suggest anything of the sort. It would have looked a bit grasping, wouldn't it?" Cecil glanced inquiringly at Sir Clinton, but the chief constable seemed averse from making any comment at this stage. Cecil took his case from his pocket and lit a fresh cigarette before continuing his story. "You don't remember Una Rainhill, I suppose?" Sir Clinton shook his head. "She's a sort of second cousin of ours," Cecil explained. "Probably you never came across her. Besides, she'd hardly be out of the nursery when you went off to South Africa. Well, she's grown up now, just about a year or two younger than Joan. You'll see her for yourself. She's staying with us just now for this coming of age of Joan's." Sir Clinton had no great difficulty in guessing, behind Cecil's restraint, his actual feelings about the girl. His voice gave him away if the words did not. "No use making a long story of it, is there?" Cecil continued. "Both Maurice and I wanted Una. So did a good many others. But she didn't want Maurice. She was quite nice about it. He'd nothing to complain of in that way. He got no encouragement from her at all. But he wouldn't take no for an answer. He was really extra keen, and I think he overdid it instead of making the best of a bad business. And finally he realized that it was me that he was up against. Una and I aren't officially engaged, or anything like that, you'll see why in a moment, but it's a case of two's company and three's none, and Maurice knows his number 3. There was more than a tinge of rancor in Cecil's voice when he came to this last sentence. Sir Clinton raised his eyebrows slightly. He did not quite admire this malevolence on the part of the successful lover against his defeated rival. Cecil apparently noticed the slight change in the chief constable's expression. "Wait a minute," he said. "You haven't heard it all yet. Before I go on, just bear in mind that there was plenty of money for all of us in the family. My father always took it for granted that I'd have enough to keep me. He'd never thought of my going into business. I've got some sort of turn for writing, and I think he hoped that I'd make some kind of name as an author. And, of course, with what I supposed was an assured income behind me, I haven't hurried much in the way of publishing my stuff. I could afford to let it lie, or so I thought." A slight gesture of Sir Clinton showed his approval of this outlook on authorship. It seemed to him that Cecil at his age could hardly have much to tell the world that it didn't know already, but he had no intention of expressing any such discouraging views. "You see how it is," Cecil continued. "As things stand, I haven't the ghost of a chance of earning a decent income for years and years. And that was the weak joint that Maurice saw and went for, damn him. He took it upon himself to tell me that I was here more or less on sufferance. He'd been generous in the past, he actually reminded me of that. But he didn't see how he was to continue to subsidize me indefinitely. You see his game? If he couldn't have Una himself, he'd take care that I shouldn't have her either. Damned dog in the manger. That's a nice sort of brother for you. I wonder what his father would think about him if he knew of this trick." He pitched away the stub of his unfinished cigarette as though with it he could rid himself of some of his feeling. "Of course there was friction, I'm putting it mildly, but there was no open row. My mother's not in good health and I couldn't afford to have her worried over my affairs. So we settled down to some sort of armed neutrality, although the thing's more or less evident to most people. That's what I meant when I said I might be kicked out any day. It's only a question of time, it seems to me. He still thinks that if I were out of the way he'd have a chance with Una, and sooner or later I expect him to give me an express ticket into the wide world. I'm trying to get some sort of job, but so far I haven't succeeded in lighting on anything that seems to offer the slightest prospects. It's no pleasure to stay here on sufferance, I can tell you." Now that Sir Clinton had received Cecil's unsolicited confidences, he hardly knew what to do with them. After all, he reflected, he had heard only one side of the story, and it was scarcely fair to judge the case on the strength of an ex-parte statement. It was not quite the Ravensthorpe which he had expected, he admitted ruefully to himself as he bent his efforts to bringing Cecil back to normal again. Money and a girl, the two things that seemed to lie behind most troubles, and even crimes, as he knew from experience. It seemed an unkind fate that had forced these two factors to the front in an environment where trouble of the kind was the last that might have been expected. One never knew what this sort of thing might lead to in the end. "I'd like to have a look at your father's collection some time or other," he said at last, to change the subject, when he had succeeded in getting Cecil into a somewhat cooler frame of mind. "I saw a good many of the things in London from time to time, as he bought them, but there must be a lot here at Ravensthorpe that will be new to me. Anything your father bought will be worth looking at. He had wonderful taste." Rather to his vexation, Sir Clinton found that he had only shifted the conversation from one sore point to another. "If you want to see anything," Cecil snapped, "you'd better pay your visit as soon as you can arrange it. Maurice is going to sell the lot." Sir Clinton was completely taken aback by this news. Sell the stuff? What on earth would he want to do that for? He's got all the money he needs, surely. Cecil dissociated himself from any connection with the matter. "No business of mine. Now. Maurice can do as he likes. Of course, I hate the idea of all these things of my father's being sold off when there seems no need for it, but it's not my affair. The Maurice boy isn't all we thought him, and since his coming to Ravensthorpe, he seems to think of very little else but money and how to get more of it. Anything for the dibs, it appears. But surely he isn't selling everything. He might get rid of some minor things, but he'll hardly break up the whole collection. Every damned thing, Sir Clinton. Why at this very moment he's got a Yankee agent, a man Foss, staying at Ravensthorpe and chaffering for the star pieces of the collections, the Medusa medallions." Sir Clinton shook his head. "They must be fresh acquisitions since my day. I've never even heard of them. Ever see the picture of Medusa in the Uffizi Gallery? It's attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, but some people say it's only a student's copy of the original Leonardo which has disappeared. It seems my father came across 3 medallions with almost exactly the same Medusa on one side and a figure of Perseus on the reverse. And what's more, he was able to get documentary proof that these things were really Leonardo's own work, strange as it seems. The thing's quite admitted by experts. So you can imagine that these Medusas are quite the star pieces in the museum. And Maurice calmly proposes to sell them to Keswick, the Yank millionaire, and Keswick has sent this man Foss over here to negotiate for them. It seems rather a pity to part with them, Sir Clinton said, regretfully. Maurice doesn't feel it so, Cecil retorted, rather bitterly. He got a friend of mine, Foxy Polgate, to make him electrotypes of them in gold. Foxy's rather good at that sort of thing for an amateur, and Maurice thinks that the electrotypes will look just as well as the originals. Sanotaphs, I suppose, Sir Clinton commented. Quite so. In memoriam. The real things being buried in the USA. Cecil paused for a moment and then concluded. You can imagine that none of us like this damned chandlering with these things that my father spent so much thought over. It's enough to make him turn in his grave to have all his favorites scattered, and just for the sake of Maurice's infernal miserliness and greed for cash. Sir Clinton rose from his seat and took a last glance at the view before him. What about moving on now? Cecil agreed, and they retraced their steps towards the pinewood. As they entered the spinney, Sir Clinton noticed another of the fairy houses set back among the trees at a little distance from the path. Another of those things. Rather to his surprise, Cecil moved over to examine the little edifice, and bending down opened the door and glanced inside. The fairy's not at home at present, he said, standing aside to let Sir Clinton look in. Something in Cecil's voice forced itself on the attention of the chief constable. The words seemed to be pointless, but in the tone there was an ill-suppressed tinge of what might almost have been malicious glee at some unexplained jest. Sir Clinton was too wary to follow up this track, wherever it might lead to. He did not quite like the expression on Cecil's face when the remark was made, and he sought for some transition which would bring them on to a fresh subject. You must have some curiosities in Ravensthorpe itself, if parts of it are as old as they seem to be. Any priest's holes, or secret passages, or things of that sort. There are one or two, Cecil admitted, but we don't make a show of them. In fact, even Joan doesn't know how to get into them. There's some sort of mistletoe bough story in the family. A girl went into one of the passages, forgot how to work the spring to get out again, lost her nerve apparently, and stayed there till she died. It so happened that she was the only one of the family in the house at the time, so there was no one to help her out. Since then, we've kept the secret of the springs from our girls. No use running risks. And even Joan hasn't wheedled it out of you. No, not even Joan. Maurice and I are the only ones who can get into these places. Sir Clinton evidently approved of this. Short of opening the passages up altogether, that seems the best thing to do. One never knows one's luck. By the way, in an old place like this you ought to have a stock of family legends. You've got these fairy houses. Is there anything else of general interest? Cecil seemed to have recovered something of his normal good humor, and his face betrayed almost a grin of amusement as he replied. Oh, yes. We've got a family ghost, or so the countryfolk say. I've never come across it myself, but it's common talk that the family spectre is a white man who walks in the woods just before the head of the family dies. All rot, you know. Nobody believes in it, really. But it's quite an old established tradition round about here. Sir Clinton laughed. You certainly don't seem to take him very seriously. What about family curses? Are you well supplied? You'd better apply to Maurice if you're keen on family curses. He seems to have specialized in that branch, if you ask me. Chapter 2. Mr. Polgate's Sense of Humor. How time flies, said Joan Chasewater, in mock despondency. Tonight I'm in my prime. Tomorrow I shall be 21, with all my bright youth behind me. 5 years after that, I shall quite possibly be married to Michael here, if I'm still alive and he hasn't died in the meantime. Then I shall sit o' nights darning his socks in horn-rimmed spectacles, and sadly recalling those glad days when I was young and still happy. It's dreadful. I feel I want to cry over it. Give me something to cry into, Michael. I seem to have mislaid my bag. Michael Clifton obligingly held out a handkerchief. Joan looked at it disparagingly. Haven't you anything smaller than that? It discourages me. I'm not going to cry on a manufacturing scale. It wouldn't be becoming. Una Rainhill laid her cigarette down on the ashtray beside her. If you're going to be as particular as that, Joan, I think I'd be content with a gulp or two of emotion or perhaps a lump in the throat. Cheer up. You've one more night before the shadows fall. Ah, there it is, said Joan, tragically. You're young, Una, and you never had any foresight, anyway. But I can see it all coming. I can see the fat ankles, she glanced down at her own slim ones, and the artificial silk stockings at 3 and 11 the pair, because Michael's business will always be mismanaged, with him at the head of it. And I'll have that red nose that comes from indigestion, because after Michael ends up in bankruptcy, we won't be able to keep a maid, and I never could cook anything whatever. And then Michael will grow fat, and short of breath and bald. That'll be quite enough for the present, interrupted the outraged Michael. I'm not so sure about letting you marry me at all, after that pleasant little sketch. If you can't drop those domineering ways of yours, Michael, I shall withdraw, Joan warned him, coldly. You can boss other people as much as you choose. I rather like to see you doing it. But it doesn't go with me, remember. If you show these distressing signs of wanting your own way, I shall simply have to score you off my list of possibles. And that would no doubt be painful to both of us, to you, at any rate. Oh, to both of us, I'm sure. I wouldn't dream of contradicting you, Joan. Where would you be, if the only serious candidate dropped out? Anything rather than that. Well, it's a blessing that one man seems to have some sense, Joan admitted, turning to the others. One can't help liking Michael, if it's only for the frank way he acknowledges when he's in the wrong. Skillful handling does a lot with the most unpromising material, of course. Cecil leaned over in his chair and peered athwart the greenery which surrounded the nook in the winter garden in which they were sitting. There's Foxy wandering round. He raised his voice. Are you looking for us, Foxy? We're over here. Foxton Polgate's freckled face, surmounted by a shock of reddish hair, appeared at the entrance to their recess. Been hunting about for you, he explained as he sat down. Couldn't make out where you'd got to. He turned to Joan. Dropped across this evening on important business. Fact is, I've lost my invitation card and the book of words. Didn't read it carefully when it came. So thought I'd drop over and hear what's what. Program, I mean, and all that sort of thing, so there'll be no hitch. Una leaned over and selected a fresh cigarette from the box. You're hopeless, Foxy, she pronounced. One of these memory courses is what you need badly. Why not treat the thing as a practical joke instead of in earnest? Then you'd have no difficulty. Jokes are the only things you ever seem to take seriously. Epigrams went completely out before you were born, Una, Foxy retorted. Don't drag 'em from their graves at this hour of the century. And don't interrupt Joan in her instructions to the guest of the evening. Don't you see she's saying 'em over nervously to herself for fear she forgets 'em? There's a bit too much of the harassed nursemaid about you, Foxy, with all your don'ts, Joan broke in. Now take your stylus and tablets and jot this down carefully, for I won't repeat it under shilling a page. Here's the program. 10 p.m., arrival of distinguished guests. They're all distinguished, except you, Foxy. Brilliant and animated conversation by those who can manage it. The rest can listen intelligently. You may try listening, Foxy, if it isn't too much of a strain. The cloakroom, picture gallery, museum, and poultry yard will be thrown open for inspection by the public absolutely free of charge. It won't cost you a cent. Bridge tables will be provided for the curiosities who don't dance. Dancing will begin straightway and will be continued up to 11:45, when the judges will take their seats. As soon as they are comfortable, the march past will start. All guests must present themselves at this without fail, Foxy. At 5 minutes to 12 the identity of the prize winners will be disclosed. When midnight strikes, all guests will remove their masks, even at the cost of shocking the company in some cases. Dancing will then be resumed and will continue into the dewy dawn. And that's how it will take place according to plan. There's just one point, said Foxy, hesitatingly. Are the prizes portable things, or shall I have to hire a van to take mine away with me? I shouldn't worry a bit about that, Foxy, said Una, comfortingly. We've decided to keep the prizes in the family, you see. Joan gets one, because it will be her birthday. I get the other for the best female costume. Cecil, Maurice, and Michael are going to toss odd man for the 2 men's prizes. So you can come as a teddy bear without pockets if you like. It won't be of any consequence. You'll have nothing to carry away. Can't say fairer than that, Foxy admitted. Always liked that plain, straightforward way of doing things myself. A recollection of his talk with Sir Clinton passed across Cecil Chasewater's mind, and without reflection he communicated it to the others. By the way, Sir Clinton seemed a trifle worried over this affair. He pointed out to me that some scallywag might creep in amongst the guests and play Old Harry in the museum if he got the chance. Just at this moment, Maurice Chasewater passed along the alley in the winter garden from which the nook opened. Maurice. Joan called to her brother. Come here for a moment, please. Maurice turned back and entered the recess. He seemed tired, and there was a certain hesitancy in his manner as though he were not quite sure of himself. His sister made a gesture inviting him to sit down, but he appeared disinclined to stay. What's the trouble? He asked, with a weary air. Cecil's been suggesting that it's hardly safe to leave the collections open tomorrow night, in case a stranger got in with a mask on. Hadn't we better have someone to stay in the museum and look after them? Cecil needn't worry his head, Maurice returned, ignoring his brother. I'm putting one of the keepers on to watch the museum. He turned on his heel and went off along the corridor. Foxy gazed after him with a peculiar expression on his face. Maurice looks a bit done up, doesn't he? He finally said, turning back towards the group about him. He hasn't been quite all right for a while. Seems almost as if he expected a thunderbolt to strike him any minute, doesn't he? A bit white about the gills and holding himself in all the time. Before anyone could reply to this, Joan rose and beckoned to Michael. Come along, Michael. I'll play you 100 up, if you like. There'll be no one in the billiard room. Michael Clifton rose eagerly from his chair and followed her out. Foxy looked after them. As an old friend of the family, merely wanting to know, are those two engaged or not? They go on as if they were and as if they weren't. It's most confusing to plain fellows like me. I doubt if they know themselves, said Una, so I'd advise you not to waste too much brain matter over it, Foxy. What do boys of your age know about such things? Not much, I admit. Cupid seems to pass me by on his rounds. Perhaps it's the red hair. Or maybe the freckles. Or because I'm not the strong, talkative sort like Michael. Or just fate, or something. I expect it's just something, as you say, Una confirmed in a sympathetic tone. That seems, somehow, to explain everything, doesn't it? As it were, yes, retorted Foxy. But don't let the fact that you've ensnared Cecil, poor chap, lead you into putting on expert airs with me. Betrays inexperience at once. That. Only the very young do it. His face lighted up. I've just thought of something. What a joke. Suppose we took the chief constable's tip and engineered a sham robbery tomorrow night? Priceless. What? Carry it through in real good style. Make Maurice sit up for a day or two, eh? Do his liver good if he'd something to worry about. Cecil's face showed indecision. I shouldn't mind giving Maurice a twinge or two just to teach him manners, he confessed. But I don't see much in the notion as it stands, Foxy. Maurice is posting a keeper in the museum, you know, and that complicates things a bit. The keeper would spot any of us tampering with things. He knows us all as well as his own brother. Not in fancy dress, with a mask on, dear boy. Don't forget that part of it. Fancy me in fancy dress. Fancy me as good Queen Bess. He hummed softly. Only I don't think I'll come as good Queen Bess, after all. Cecil knitted his brows slightly and seemed to be considering Fox's idea. I wouldn't mind giving Maurice a start, he admitted half reluctantly. And your notion might be good enough if one could work it out properly. Question is, can you? Suppose you suddenly make a grab for some of the stuff. The keep'll be down on you like a shot. He'll yell for help, and you'll be pinched for a cert. Before you could get away. There doesn't seem to be anything in it, Foxy. Hold on for a minute. I'll see my way through it. Foxy took a cigarette, lighted it, and seemed to cogitate deeply over the first few puffs. I've got it, he announced. It's dead easy. Suppose one of us grabs the keeper while the other helps himself to the till? We could easily knock out the keeper between us and get off all right without an alarm being raised. Cecil shook his head. No, I draw the line at using a sandbag or a knuckle duster on our own keeper. That's barred, Foxy. Think again. There's a way, Foxy assured him sententiously. Give me another jiffy or two. This is how it goes. We mustn't knock out the keeper. We mustn't be recognized. We've got to get away scot-free, or the joke would be on us. These the conditions. Cecil nodded. This is where pure genius comes in, Foxy announced with pride. How does one recognize anyone? By looking at him. So if the keeper can't look at us, he won't recognize us. That's as sound as Euclid, if not sounder. Well, asked Una, joining in the conversation. Well, he won't recognize us if the place is dark, then, explained Foxy, triumphantly. All we have to do is to get the light in the room switched off, and the thing's as good as done. That seems to hit the mark, Cecil agreed. But that makes it a three-handed job, you know, one to grab the keeper, one to snaffle the stuff, and one to pull out the fuse of the museum light from the fuse box. Where's our third man? Una leaned forward eagerly. I'll do that part for you. I'd like to make Maurice sit up. He hasn't been very nice to me lately, and I want to pay him out just a little. Nonsense, Una, Cecil interrupted. You can't be mixed up in a joke of this sort. There's almost bound to be a row after it. It doesn't matter in my case. Maurice has his knife into me anyway, you know. But there's no need for you to be getting your fingers nipped. Una brushed the suggestion aside. What can Maurice do to me even if he does find out? I've nothing to do with him. And, besides, how is he going to find out anything about it? I suppose you'll just keep the things for a day or two and then return them by some way that he can't trace. He'll never know who did it, unless we let it out ourselves. And we mustn't let it out, of course. Foxy nodded his agreement. Cecil was longer in his consideration, but at last he seemed to fall in with the arrangement. Well, so long as Una's name isn't mixed up in it, Foxy, I'm your man. It's a silly caper, but I'm not above going into it for the sport of vexing my good brother. Right, said Foxy, with relief. Now the next article. What's the best thing to go for? It must be portable, of course. Cecil pondered for a moment. Then, as a thought struck him, he laughed. Here's the game. It may be news to you, Foxy, but my good brother is taking steps to sell off our collections. Foxy was quite plainly staggered by this news. All the stuff your father got together? Surely not. Well, that's the limit. Quite, confirmed Cecil. I'd prevent it if I could, but he's got the whip hand, and that's all there is to it. Foxy seemed still slightly incredulous. Why, your governor loved that stuff as it were a child. And Maurice doesn't need the money he'll get for it. It's shameful. My word. If I were in your shoes, Cecil, I believe I'd really steal the stuff instead of only pretending to grab it. I'm sorely tempted, said Cecil, half grimly. Now here's the point. It seems Maurice has got into touch with Keswick, the Yank millionaire. Keswick wants to buy the Medusa medallions, the very thing my father set most store by in the whole lot. Keswick sent over an agent of his, this fellow Foss who's staying here just now, to settle up the business, see to the genuineness of the things, and so forth. I've nothing against Foss. He's only doing his job and he seems all right. I don't like some of his American manners, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, the deal's just going to be closed. Now if we lift these medallions, won't Maurice look an extra-sized ass? Absoluto, said Foxy. I see what you're after. We lift em. Foss wants em at once. He can't get em. P wraps the deals off, for the time at least. And Maurice looks a prize ape. Yes, Cecil snapped, angrily. That'll perhaps teach him a lesson. Una Rainhill had been thinking while this last part of the conversation had been going on. There's one thing you haven't provided against, Foxy, she pointed out. Suppose you manage everything as you've arranged. Even if you get clear away from the museum, there's almost certain to be someone in the passage outside who'll see you rush out. And then the game would be up. It's not enough to douse the light in the museum. You'll need to put all the house lights out as well. That's sound, Foxy agreed at once. That means that you'll need to pull out the main switch instead of just the fuse of the museum. It's an even easier job, with no chance of a mistake in it. And what a spree it'll be. The whole shop will be buzzing like an overturned hive. It'll be great sport. And, of course, there'll be such a wild confusion before they get the lights on again, that we'll come out of it absolutely okay. All we have to do is to saunter quietly out of the museum and help to restore order among the rabble in the dark. By the time the lights go on again, we'll be anywhere it suits us to be. That's a masterstroke of yours, Una. Couldn't be bettered. Cecil glanced at his wristwatch. Time's getting on, Foxy. We've sketched the general idea, but we must get this thing down to dots now. Everything will depend on synchronizing things exactly. We can't afford to leave affairs to the last moment, for we mustn't be seen together, you know, tomorrow night. Foxy nodded assent and pulled out a notebook. Here it is, then, he declared. I'll make 3 copies, one for each of us, and we can burn 'em once we've memorized 'em later on. Now, first of all, we can't start our game too early. That'd be a mistake. Let 'em all get well mixed up in dancing and so forth, before we begin operations." Cecil and Una assented to this at once. "Midnight's the limit at the other end," Foxy pointed out. "Can't afford to wait for the unmasking, for then the keeper would know us and remember we'd been in the museum when the thing happened." His fellow conspirators made no objection. "In between those limits, I think this would be about right," Foxy proposed. "First of all, we set our 3 watches to the same time. Better do it now, for fear of forgetting." When this had been done, he continued, "At 11:40 Una goes to the main switch. You'll have to show her where it is, Cecil, either tonight or tomorrow morning. At 11:40, also, Cecil and I wander independently into the museum. I remember quite well where the medallions are kept." "Wait a moment," interrupted Cecil. "Just remember that the 3 real medallions and your 3 electrotypes are lying side by side in the glass case. The real medallions are in the top row, your electros are the bottom row." Foxy made a note of this and then went on. "Your business, Cecil, will be to mark down the keeper. Get so near him that you can jump on him for certain the very instant the lights go out. Make sure you can get his hands or his wrists at the first grab. You mustn't fumble it or you'll shipwreck the whole caboodle." "I'll manage it all right," Cecil assured him. "In the meantime I'll be stooping over the medallion case, looking at the stuff, with something in my hand to break the glass. I'll have a thick glove, so as not to get cut with the edges when I put my hand in." "That's sound," said Cecil. "I hadn't thought of the splinters." "Blood would give us away at once," Foxy pointed out. "Now comes the real business." At 11:45 precisely Una pulls out the switch. As soon as the light goes, Cecil jumps on the keeper while I smash the glass of the case and grab the top row of the medallions. After that, we both cut for the door and mingle with the mob. And remember, not a word said during the whole affair. Our voices would give us away to the keeper. He scribbled 2 extra copies of his timetable and handed one of these to each of the other conspirators. "Now, for my sake, don't botch this business," he added. "I've played a joke or 2 in my time, but this is the best I've ever done, and I don't want it spoiled by inattention to details. It'll be worth all the trouble to see Maurice's face when he finds what's happened." Chapter 3. The Theft at the Masked Ball. "I'm thankful I took my wings off," said Ariel, leaning back in her chair with a soft sigh of satisfaction. "You've no notion how much you long to sit down when you know you daren't do it for fear of crushing the frames of these things. It's not tiredness, it's simply tantalization." She turned her eyes inquisitively on the bearded figure of her partner. "I wonder who you're supposed to be," she mused. "You ought to have a ticket, with a costume like that. I can't guess who you imagine you are, or who you really are, for that matter." Her companion showed no desire to enlighten her on the last point. "My quaint Ariel, hark in thine ear," he quoted, but she failed to recognize the tones of his voice. "Oh, now I see. We did The Tempest one year at school. So you're Prospero, are you? Well, let's begin by any misunderstandings. If you think you're entitled to act your part by ordering me about, you're far mistaken. My trade union positively refuses to permit any overtime." "I've left my book and staff in the cloakroom," Prospero confessed, laughingly, otherwise, malignant spirit. "That's my noble master," quoted Ariel, ironically. Prospero was a cross old thing. "I suppose you couldn't even throw in a bit of conjuring to keep up appearances? It's almost expected of you." Prospero looked cautiously round the winter garden in which they were sitting. "Not much field here for my illimitable powers," he grumbled disparagingly, "unless you'd like me to turn Falstaff over there into a white rabbit. And that would startle his partner somewhat, I'm afraid, so we'd better not risk it." He pondered for a moment. "I hate to disappoint you, Ariel. What about a turn at divination? Would it amuse you if I told your fortune, revealed the secrets of your soul, and what not? This is how I do it. It's called botonomancy, if you desire to pursue your studies on a more convenient occasion." He stretched up his hand and plucked a leaf from the tropical plant above his head. Ariel watched him mischievously from behind her mask. "Well, Prospero, get along with it, will you? The next dance will be starting sooner than immediately." Prospero pretended to study the leaf minutely before continuing. I see a girl who likes to play at having her own way, and isn't too scrupulous in her methods of getting it. She is very happy. Happier, perhaps, than she has ever been before. I see 2 thresholds, one of which she has just crossed, the other which she will cross after this next dance, I think. Yes, that is correct. There's some influence in the background. He broke off and regarded Ariel blandly. So much for the signs. Now for the interpretation. You are obviously in the very early 20s, so I infer that the threshold you are about to cross lies between your 20th and 21st birthday. Putting that along with the character which the leaf revealed. Why, Ariel, you must be Miss Joan Chasewater, and you've just got engaged. You seem to know me all right, Prospero, Joan admitted. But how about the engagement? It's too dim in here for you to have seen my ring, and besides, I've had my hand in the folds of my dress ever since I sat down. Except for one moment when you settled the band round your hair, Prospero pointed out. The ring you're wearing is more than a shade too large for your finger. Obviously it's so new that you haven't had time to get it altered to fit, yet. You seem to notice things, Joan admitted. I wonder who you are. Prospero brushed her inquiry aside. A little parlor conjuring to finish up the part in due form, he suggested. It's almost time for our dance. Look. He held out an empty hand for Joan's inspection, then made a slight snatch in the air as if seizing something in flight. When he extended his hand again, a small diamond star glittered in the palm. Take it, Joan, said Sir Clinton in his natural voice. I meant to send it to you tomorrow, but at the last moment I thought I might as well bring it with me and have the pleasure of giving it to you myself. It's your birthday present. I'm an old enough friend to give you diamonds on a special occasion like this. You took me in completely, Joan admitted, after she had thanked him. I couldn't make out who you were, and I thought you were the limit in insolence when you began talking about my private affairs. It's Michael Clifton, of course. Sir Clinton asked. Why of course? One would think he'd been my last chance, by the way you put it. This living on a magic island has ruined your manners, my good Prospero. Well, he won't let you down, Joan. You, shall I say, even you, to be tactful, couldn't have done better in the raffle. Before Joan could reply, a girl in Egyptian costume came past their chairs. Joan stopped her with a gesture. Pin this pretty thing in the front of my band. Please, Cleopatra. Be sure you get it in the right place. She held out the diamond star. Cleopatra took it without comment and fastened it in position hastily. Sit down, Joan invited. Your next partner will find you here when he comes. Tell us about Caesar and Antony and all the rest of your disreputable past. Make it exciting. Cleopatra shook her head. Sorry, I can't stop just now. Neither Julius nor Antony put in an appearance tonight, so I'm spending my arts on a mere centurion. He's a stickler for punctuality, being a Roman soldier. She glanced at her wristwatch. I must fly at once. Au reservoir. As we say in Egypt, you know. With a nod of farewell, she hastened along the alley and out of the winter garden. She seems a trifle nervous about something, Sir Clinton commented, indifferently. Joan smoothed down her filmy tunic. Isn't it time we moved? She asked. I see Falstaff's gone away, so you can't turn him into a white rabbit now, and there doesn't seem to be anything else you could enchant just at present. The orchestra will be starting in a moment, anyhow. She rose as she spoke. Sir Clinton followed her example, and they made their way out of the winter garden. What costume is Michael Clifton wearing tonight? Asked Sir Clinton as the orchestra played the opening bars of the dance. I ought to congratulate him, and it's easier to pick him up at a distance if I know how he's dressed. Look for something in 18th century clothes and a large wig, then, Joan directed. He says he's Macheath out of the Beggar's Opera. I suppose he's quite as like that as anything else. You'll perhaps recognize him best by a large artificial mole at the left corner of his mouth. I observed it particularly myself. She noticed that her partner seemed more on the alert than the occasion required. What are you worried about? She demanded. You seem to be listening for something, and you can't hear anything, you know, even if you tried, because of the orchestra. Sir Clinton shook off his air of preoccupation. The fact is, Joan, I've been worried all evening. I'm really afraid of something happening tonight. I don't much like this mask business with all that stuff in the collections. I've a feeling in my bones that there might be trouble. Joan laughed at his gloomy premonitions. You won't be kept on the rack much longer. That's one good thing. There's just this dance, then the march past for judging the costumes, and then it will be midnight when everybody must unmask. So you'll have to make the best of your fears in the next half hour. After that there'll be no excuse for them. Meanwhile, on with the dance, said Sir Clinton. I see it's no use trying to give you a nightmare. You're too poor a subject to repay the labor and trouble. Besides, this music's terribly straining on the vocal cords if one tries to compete with it. As he spoke, however, the orchestra reached a diminuendo in the score and sank to comparative quietness. Joan looked here and there about the room as they danced and at last detected the figure for which she was searching. That's Michael over there, she pointed out, the one dancing with the girl dressed as. Across the sound of the music there cut the sharp report of a small-caliber pistol fired in some adjacent room. On the heels of it came the crash and tinkle of falling glass, and, almost simultaneously, a cry for help in a man's voice. Sir Clinton let Joan's hand go and turned to the door, but before he could take a step, the lights above them vanished and the room was plunged in darkness. Joan felt a hand come out and grip her arm. That you, Joan? Yes. They've taken out the main switch, Sir Clinton said hurriedly. Get hold of some man at once and show him where it is. We want the lights as quick as possible. I can trust you not to lose your head. Take a man with you for fear of trouble. We don't know what's happening. Very well, Joan assured him. Hurry. Sir Clinton urged. His hand dropped from her arm as he moved invisibly away towards the door. In the darkness around her she could hear movements and startled exclamations. The orchestra, after mechanically playing a couple of bars, had fallen to silence. Someone blundered into her and passed on before she could put out her hand. Well, at least I know where the door is, she assured herself, and she began to move towards it. Meanwhile the cries for help continued to come from the museum. Then, abruptly, they were hushed, and she shuddered as she thought of what that cessation might mean. She moved forward and came to what seemed an unobstructed space on the floor, over which she was able to advance freely. Her whole senses were concentrated on reaching the exit, but her mind appeared to work independently of her own volition and to conjure up the possibilities behind this series of events. Sir Clinton had evidently expected some criminal attempt that night, and he had assumed that the museum would be the objective. But suppose he were wrong. Perhaps the affair in the museum was only a blind to draw towards it all the men outside the ballroom. Then, when they were disposed of, there might come an incursion here. Most of the women had taken advantage of their fancy dress to deck themselves out with jewelry, and a few armed men could easily reap a small fortune in a minute or two. Despite the soundness of her nerves, she began to feel anxious, and to conjure up still more appalling pictures. Suddenly her eyes were dazzled by a flash of light as a man beside her struck a match. Almost at the same moment she felt a hand on her shoulder and she was pulled backward so brusquely that she almost lost her balance and slipped. "Put out that match, you fool," said Michael's voice. "Do you want to have these girls' dresses in a blaze?" The flare of the match had revealed a circle of startled faces. The room was filled with excited voices and a sound of confused movements. Over at the orchestra a music stand fell with a clash of metal. Then, close beside her in the darkness, Joan heard a girl's voice repeating monotonously in tones of acute fear, "What does it mean? Oh, what does it mean?" "Much good that does anyone," Joan muttered, contemptuously. Then, aloud, she called, "Michael." Before he could reply, there came a sharp exclamation in a man's voice. "Stand back, there. My partner's fainted." The possibilities involved in a panic suddenly became all too clear in Joan's mind. If half a dozen people lost their heads, the girl might be badly hurt. Michael's voice was lifted again, in a tone that would have carried through a storm at sea. "Everybody stand fast. You'll be trampling the girl underfoot if you don't take care. Stand still, confound you. Pull the blinds up and throw back the curtains. It's a moonlight night." There was a rustling as those nearest the windows set about the execution of his orders. Light suddenly appeared, revealing the strained faces and uneasy attitudes of the company. Joan turned to Michael. "Come with me and put in the switch, Michael. Sir Clinton's gone to the museum. We must get the lights on quick." Michael, with a word to his partner, followed his fiancée towards the door. A thought seemed to strike him just as he was leaving the room. "Wait here, everybody, till we get the lights on again. You'll just run risks by moving about in the dark outside. It's nothing. Probably only a fuse blown. Now then, Joan, where's that switch?" he added as they passed out of the door. It was pitch dark in the rest of the house, but Joan knew her way and was able to grope along the corridors without much difficulty. As they came near the switch box, the lights flashed up again. One of the servants appeared round a corner. Someone had pulled out the switch, sir, he explained. It took me some time to make my way to it and put it in again. Stout fellow, said Michael, approvingly. At that moment, a voice shouted above the confused noises of the house. Come on, you fellows. He's got away. Lend hand to chase him. And a sound of running steps filled the hall, as the male guests poured out in answer to the summons. You don't need me any longer, Joan? Michael questioned. Right. Then I'm off to lend a hand. He ran to join the rest. Left alone, Joan retraced her steps to the ballroom, but instead of re-entering it, she passed on in the direction of the museum, with a number of the guests were making their way also. I hope nobody's got badly hurt, she thought to herself as she hurried along. I do wish I'd taken the hint and not asked to have that collection thrown open tonight. Much to her relief, she found Sir Clinton sitting on a chair beside the museum door. In the doorway stood the keeper, looking none the worse and busying himself with fending off the more inquisitive among the guests who wished to enter the room. Joan noticed that the museum itself was in darkness, though the lights were burning in the rest of the house. You're not hurt, are you, Sir Clinton? She asked as she came up to him. Nothing to speak of. The fellow kicked me on the ankle as he came out. I'm temporarily lamed, that's all. Nothing to worry about, I think. He rubbed his ankle as he spoke. Are you all right, Mould? Joan inquired. The keeper reassured her. No harm done, Miss Joan. They didn't hurt me. But I'm sorry, miss, I didn't manage to get hold of them. They were on me before I could do anything, me being so taken aback by the lights going out. What's happened? Joan questioned Sir Clinton. Has anything been stolen? We don't know yet what's gone, he replied, answering her last question first. The bulk of the lamps smashed in there, he nodded towards the museum. And until they bring a fresh one, we can't find out what damage has been done. As to what happened, it seems rather confused at present, but I expect we shall get it cleared up eventually. There seems to have been a gang at work, and I'm afraid some things may be missing when we begin to look over the collection. I wish I'd taken your hint, Joan admitted, frankly. It's partly my blame, I feel, for neglecting your advice. I was silly to laugh at you when you spoke about it. I shouldn't worry about it, if I were you, Joan, Sir Clinton reassured her. It was really only one chance in a million that anything of the sort would happen tonight. Besides, if we manage to nail this fellow that they're all after, we may be able to get some clue to his confederates. Quite evidently there was a gang at work, and he may be induced to split on his friends if we can lay hands on him, and then we'll get the stuff back again without much trouble, I hope. He glanced at her, as though to see the effect of his words. Then, as his eyes caught her mask, he seemed struck by another idea. That reminds me, he said, we must get these masks off. Send some one round at once, please, Joan, to order everyone to unmask now. And have all the outer doors shut, too. It's a futile precaution, I'm afraid, because anyone could slip out during the confusion when there was no light, but we may as well do what we can even at this stage. He removed his own mask as he spoke, and pulled away the false beard which he had worn as Prospero. Joan loosened her mask and went off to give the necessary orders. In a few moments she returned. Now tell me what did happen, she demanded. There's no one killed, or even hurt, Sir Clinton assured her. This ankle of mine's the only casualty, so far as I know, and I expect I'll be able to limp about quite comfortably by tomorrow. I'm thankful it's no worse, said Joan, with relief. All I know about the business comes from Mould. Here, Sir Clinton went on. It seems he was patrolling the museum at the time the thing happened, under your brother's orders. Perhaps half a dozen people, under a dozen, he says, at any rate, were in the place then. Some of them were examining the cases in the bays. Some of them were looking at the things in the big center case. Mould doesn't remember what costumes they were wearing. I don't blame him. People had been passing in and out all through the evening, and there was no reason why he should take particular note of the guests at that special moment. Sir Clinton glanced up at the keeper, who was looking rather ashamed at his inability to furnish better information. Don't you worry, Mould. I doubt if I'd have had any more to tell, myself, if I'd been there. One can't be expected to remember everything. He turned back to Joan. The next thing that happened was a pistol shot, and the light went out. Some light filtered in from the door of the room, for the lamps in the hall here were still blazing. But before Mold could do anything, someone gripped him from behind and got his wrists twisted behind his back. In the struggle, Mold was swung round, so that he couldn't see the central case even in what light there was. Then the lights outside were switched off and he heard a smashing of glass. There was a bit of a struggle, apparently, and then all at once he felt himself let loose. As soon as he got free, he lit a match and posted himself at the door to prevent anyone getting away, and he stayed there until the lights went on again. Then he made all his prisoners unmask, and those whom he didn't recognize himself he kept there until someone he knew came to identify them. They're all people you know quite well, Joan. More than half of them were girls, who seem rather unlikely people to go in for robbery with violence, to put it mildly. Mold made a list of them, if we happen to need it. But I don't think we're likely to find the criminal amongst them. This affair was too well planned for that. The real gang have got clean away, I'm pretty sure. And what about your ankle? Demanded Joan. Oh, that? I happened to arrive at the door fairly quickly after the lights went out. Just as I got to it, a fellow came dashing out, and I made a grab at him as well as I could in the dark. But one can't see what one's doing, and I didn't get a decent grip on him as he charged out on top of me. He landed me a fairly effective kick, right on the ankle bone, by bad luck, and then, before I could get my hands on him properly, he tore himself clear and was off down the hall towards the front door. I hobbled after him as best I could, and there he was, a fellow dressed in Pierrot costume, running quite leisurely over the gravel sweep and making for the woods. I couldn't go after him, but he was quite clear in the moonlight and he'd a long way to go before getting into cover, so I raised a hue and cry at once, and quite a crowd of stout fellows after him. He'll have to run a bit faster than he was doing, if he expects to get off. These pine woods have no undergrowth to speak of, and he'll find it difficult to conceal himself in a hurry. As Sir Clinton ended his narrative, a servant came hurrying up the hall, bringing a tall pair of steps with him. Is that the new lamp? Sir Clinton demanded. All right. Light a match or two, Mold, to let him see where to put the steps. And don't tramp about too much while you're fixing them up, please. I want to see things undisturbed as far as possible. Chapter 4. The Chase in the Woods. In earlier days, Michael Clifton had been reckoned among the more creditable runners in the school mile, and he had never allowed himself to fall out of training. Thus, as he joined the throng of would-be pursuers emerging from the house, he felt a certain confidence that the fugitive would at any rate have to put his best foot foremost if he was to avoid being run down. Before he had covered 20 yards, however, Michael found himself handicapped by his costume. The full-bottomed wig dropped off almost immediately, and the shoes were not so troublesome as he had feared, but the sleeves of his coat interfered with his movements, and the long skirts hampered his legs. I wonder if these coves in the 18th century ever ran a step, he grumbled. If they did it in this kit, they must have been wonders. I must get rid of the truck. He pulled up and stripped off the full-skirted coat. Then, as an afterthought, he removed the long waistcoat as well. While doing this, he glanced ahead to see how the chase was progressing. The light of the full moon, now at its highest in the cloudless heavens, lit up the whole landscape before him almost as clearly as daylight. Far ahead, he could see the white figure of the escaping thief as it ascended the long, gentle slope towards the pine woods. I wonder what tempted the beggar to choose that particular costume on a night like this, Michael speculated. It's the most conspicuous affair he could have put on. Well, all the better for us. The quarry had evidently secured a fair start, for the nearest group of pursuers was still a considerable distance behind him. The hunters were strung out in an irregular file, knotted here and there with groups of 3 or 4 runners, and the line extended back almost to Michael's position. Behind him, he could hear fresh reinforcements emerging from the house, shouting as they came. They'd better save their breath, Michael commented critically to himself. That long rise'll take it out of a good many of them. He settled down to his favorite stride, and very soon began to overtake the laggards at the tail of the chase. In front of him he saw a Cardinal Richelieu with kilted cassock, but the Cardinal found his costume too much for him and pulled out of the race as Michael passed him. Shortly after, Michael drew level with an early 19th century dandy, and for a few seconds they raced neck and neck. The dandy, however, was unable to stay the pace. It's these damned Johnny Walker boots, he gasped, as he fell behind. Michael, running comfortably, began to take a faint amusement in the misfortunes of his colleagues. He could not help smiling as he passed a minotaur, sitting beside the track and making furious efforts to disentangle himself from his pasteboard bull's head, which seemed to have become clamped in position. But as he found 2 more of the hunters by the wayside, a fresh point of view occurred to him. If they're going to drop out at this rate, there won't be many of us left at the finish to tackle the beggar, and he's armed. We'll need all the men we can scrape up, if we're to make sure of him. Glancing ahead again, he was relieved to see that he had gained a fair amount of ground on the fugitive, and now he began to pass runner after runner, as the rising slope told on the weaker pursuers. He reached the group at the head of the chase just as the escaping burglar dashed into the shadow of the woods 100 yards in advance. He'll dodge us now, if he can, Michael warned his companions, who evidently were unacquainted with the ground. Keep your eyes on him at any cost. But as they entered the pine arcades, Michael found that he was mistaken. The quarry maintained his lead, but he made no effort to leave the beaten track. Ahead of them they could see his white-clad figure dappled with light and darkness as he sped up the broad pathway. Suddenly, Michael remembered what lay beyond the pinewood. Without raising his voice, for fear the runner in front should hear him, he explained the situation. He doesn't know what he's running into. There's a big quarry up there, with barbed wire fences on each side. If we can keep him straight for it, we'll have him pinned. On went the fugitive, still maintaining his lead and glancing over his shoulder from time to time, as though he were gauging the distance which separated him from his closest pursuers. The beggar can run, certainly, Michael admitted to himself. But running isn't going to help him much in a minute or two. We have him on toast. In a few moments the moon shone bright through the trees ahead. As they reached the edge of the wood, the white figure in front of them showed up clearly as it sprinted across the strip of open ground, straight for the spinney which bounded the quarry cliff. With a gesture, Michael called his motley group to a halt. "Wait a minute," he ordered. "You, Mephistopheles, get off to the left there, outside the spinney. Go on until you strike barbed wire. Take this prehistoric man. Oh, it's you, is it, Frankie? Well, both of you get down there and act as stoppers, so that he can't sneak off along the fence. Oliver Cromwell and you in the funny coat. You're to do the same over yonder on the right. Put some hurry into it, now. And don't move in towards him till you get the word. The rest of you, extend a bit along the near edge of the spinney. Not too close. Give yourselves a chance of spotting him if he breaks cover. And don't yell unless you actually see him. We've got him shut in now, and we can afford to wait for reinforcements. Here they come." 2 panting runners breasted the hill as he spoke. At this moment there came from beyond the spinney the sound of a splash. Michael was taken aback. The beggar can't have dived over, surely. It's full of rocks down below. We'll have to hurry up. He might get away, after all, if he's extra lucky. A fresh group of pursuers gave him the reinforcements he needed, and he fed them into his cordon at its weak points. Passed the word for the whole line to close in. The cordon began to contract around the spinney, the wide gaps in it closing up as it advanced. "The beggar's probably got a pistol. Look out for yourselves among the trees," Michael cautioned them as they reached the boundary of the plantation. "Don't hurry. And keep in touch, whatever you do." He himself was at the center of the line and was the first to enter the tiny wood. The advance was slow, for here there was some undergrowth which might offer a hiding place to the fugitive, and this was carefully scrutinized, clump by clump, before the line moved forward as a whole. Michael meant to make certain of capturing the burglar, and he could afford now to go about the matter deliberately. Fresh reinforcements in 2s and 3s were still streaming in from the pinewood. It took only a few minutes, however, to draw his screen through the spinney, for the belt of trees was a narrow one. Every instant he expected to hear a shout indicating that the quarry had been run to earth, but none came. His line emerged intact from the trees, forming an arc of which the cliff face was the chord, and as his men came out into the moonlight Michael had to admit to himself that no one could well have crept through any gap in the cordon. "He must be out here, hiding among these seats," he shouted. "Don't break your line any more than you can help. Advance to that balustrade in front. Rush him, if he shows up." Now that he was sure of his quarry, Michael at last had leisure to note the tincture of the bizarre in the scene before him. The high-riding moon whitened the terrace and touched with glamour the motley costumes of the hunters preparing for their final swoop. Here Robin Hood and a hatless Flying Dutchman were stooping to peer below one of the marble seats. Farther along the line Lohengrin and a milkman discussed something eagerly in whispers. On the left the prehistoric man loomed up like a troglodyte emerging from his cave, while beyond him Mephistopheles leaned upon the railing, scanning the water below. From the inky shadow of the spinney Felix the cat stole softly out to join the cordon. "A weird-looking gang we are," Michael commented to himself as he gazed about him. Only a few steps separated the hunters from the clear floor of the terrace. In a second or two at most, the man they were chasing must break cover and make a dash for liberty or else tamely surrender. Slowly the line crept forward. "We've got him now," a voice cried, exultantly. But the living net swept on past the marble tier without catching anything in its meshes. Between it and the balustrade was nothing but the untenanted paving of the terrace. "He's got away," ejaculated someone in tones of complete amazement. "Well, I'm damned if I see how he managed it." The chain broke up into individuals, who hurried hither and thither on the esplanade, searching even in the most unlikely spots for the missing fugitive. All at once Michael's eye caught something which had been concealed in the shadows thrown by the moon. "Here's a rope, you fellows. He's gone down the face of the cliff. Swum the lake, probably." Mephistopheles dissented in a languid drawl. "Not he, Clifton. I've had my eye on the water ever since I got up to the barbed wire. You could spot the faintest ripple in this moonshine. He didn't get off that way." "Sure of that?" demanded Michael. "Dead sure. I watched specially." Michael hesitated for a moment or two, considering the situation. Then his face cleared. "I see it. I remember there's a cave right below here, in the cliff face. He's gone to ground there. Half of you get through the barbed wire on the right. The rest take the left side. Line up on the banks when you get down to the water. He may swim for it yet if we don't hurry." They raced off to carry out his instructions, while Michael pulled up the rope and flung it on the terrace. "That cuts off his escape in this direction," he said to himself. "Now we can dig him out at leisure." Without hurrying, he made his way down to the water. "There used to be a raft of sorts here," he explained. "If we can rout it out, we'll be able to ferry across to the cave mouth without much bother. I doubt if he'll show fight once we lay our hands on him, for he hasn't an earthly chance of getting away." He poked about among the sedge on the rim of the lakelet and at last discovered the decrepit raft. "This thing'll just bear two of us. Do we dig the beggar out or starve him out?" "Dig him out, eh? Well, I want someone to go with me. Here, you, Frankie," he turned to the prehistoric man, "you'd better come along. If it comes to a ducking, you've got fewer clothes to spoil than the rest of us." Nothing loath, the prehistoric man scrambled aboard the raft, which sank ominously under the extra weight. "I can't find anything to pole with," grumbled Michael. "Paddle with your flippers, Frankie. It's the only thing to do. Get busy with it." Under this primitive method of propulsion, the progress of the raft was slow, but at last they succeeded in bringing it under the cliff face, after which they were able to work it along by hand. Gradually they maneuvered it into position in front of the cave mouth, which stood only a yard or so above water level. Michael leaned forward to the entrance. "You may as well come out quietly," he warned the inmate. "It's no good trying to put up a fight. You haven't a dog's chance." There was no reply of any sort. "Hold the damned raft steady, Frankie. You nearly had me overboard," expostulated Michael. "I'm going to light a match. The cave's as black as the pit, and I can see nothing." He pulled a silver matchbox from his trousers pocket. "Lucky I hadn't this in my coat, for you don't look as if you had a pocket of any sort on you, Frankie." The first match, damped by the moisture on his hands, sputtered and died out. "Hurry up, governor," shouted Mephistopheles, cheerfully, from the bank. "Don't keep us up all night with your firework display. It's getting a bit chilly, paddling about amongst this sedge. Not at all the temperature I'm accustomed to at home." Michael felt for another match and lighted it successfully. Standing up on the raft, he held the light above his head and peered into the cavity in the rock. The prehistoric man heard him exclaim in amazement. "Damnation, Frankie. He's not here. It's hardly a cave at all." He put his hands on the cave floor. "Hold tight with the raft. I'm going in to make sure." He scrambled up into the hollow, but almost immediately his face appeared again in the moonlight. "Nothing here. The hole's barely big enough to take me in." "Then where's he gone?" demanded the prehistoric man, who was a creature of few words. "I dunno. Must have given us the slip somehow. If he isn't here, he must be somewhere else. No getting round that." He shouted the news to the watchers on the banks, and a confused sound of argument rose from amongst the sedge. "Not much use hanging round the old home, Frankie. Pull for shore, sailor. We'd best manhandle her along the face of the cliff. I've had enough of that paddling." When they touched firm ground again they were surrounded by their friends, most of whom seemed to doubt whether the search of the cave had been properly carried out. "I tell you," declaimed the exasperated Michael, "I got right into the damned hole. It's so small that I nearly broke my nose against the back wall as I heaved myself inside. It would have been a tight fit for me and a squirrel together. He's not there, whether you like it or not. I can't help your troubles, Tommy. You can go and look for yourself. If you like the job of lying on your tummy on a raft, that's a wash. I shan't interfere with your simple pleasures." "But we've lost him. Is that plain enough? There's nothing to be done but go home again with our tails between our legs. I'm going now." He accompanied his friends to the top of the cliff again, but when he reached the terrace a fresh thought struck him, and he loitered behind while the others, soaked and disconsolate, made their way down into the pine wood. When the last of them had disappeared, Michael retraced his steps to the edge of the cliff. He reached here all right, he assured himself, and he didn't break back through the cordon. He stooped down, picked up the rope, and refastened it round one of the pillars of the balustrade. Everyone knows there are secret passages about Ravensthorpe, he mused. Perhaps this beggar has got on to one of them. And quite possibly the end of the passage is in that cave down there. That would explain the rope. I'll slide down and have another look round. He got into the cave mouth without difficulty and used up the remainder of his matches in a close examination of the interior of the cavity, but even the closest scrutiny failed to reveal anything to his eyes. Nothing there but plain rock, so far as I can see, he had to admit to himself as the last match burned out. That's a blank end in more senses than one. Without much difficulty he swarmed up the rope again, untied it from the balustrade, and coiled it over his arm. A nice little clue for Sir Clinton Driffield to puzzle over, he assured himself. Sherlock Holmes would have been onto it at once, found where it was sold in no time, discovered who bought it before 5 minutes had passed, and paralyzed Watson with the whole story that same evening over a pipeful of shag. We shall see. He threw a last glance round the empty terrace and then moved off into the spinney. As he passed into the shadow of the trees he saw, a few yards to one side, the outline of the fairy house dappled in the moonshine which filtered through the leaves overhead. Half unconsciously, Michael halted and looked at the little building. They could never have overlooked that in the hunt, surely. Well, no harm in having a peep to make certain. He dropped his coil of rope, stepped across to the house, and, stooping down, flung open the door. Inside, he caught a flash of some white fabric. It's the beggar after all. Here. Come out of that. He gripped the inmate roughly and hauled him by main force out of his retreat. Pierrot costume, right enough, he said to himself as he extracted the man little by little from his refuge. Then, having got his victim into the open, now we'll turn you over and have a look at your face. Good God! Maurice! For as he turned the man on his back, it was the face of Maurice Chasewater that met his eyes. But it was not a normal Maurice whom he saw. The features were contorted by some excessive emotion the like of which Michael had never seen. "Let me alone, damn you," Maurice gasped, and turned over once more on his face, resting his brow on his arm as though to shut out the spectacle of Michael's astonishment. "Are you ill?" Michael inquired, solicitously. "For God's sake leave me alone. Don't stand there gaping. Clear out, I tell you." Michael looked at him in amazement. "I'm going to have a cheerful kind of brother-in-law before all's done, it seems," he thought to himself. "Can I do anything for you, Maurice?" "Oh, go to hell." Michael turned away. "It's fairly clear he doesn't like my company," he reflected, as he stepped across and picked up his coil of rope from the ground. "But I've known politer ways of showing it, I must say." With a final glance at the prostrate figure of Maurice, he walked on and took the road back to Ravensthorpe. But as he went a vision of Maurice's face kept passing before his mind's eye. There's something damned far wrong with that beggar, whether it's an evil conscience or cramp in the tummy. It might be either of them, by the look of him. He didn't seem to want any assistance from me. That looks more like the evil conscience theory. He dismissed this with a laugh, but gradually he grew troubled. There he was, in white, same as the burglar. He's in a bit of a bait at being discovered, that's clear enough. He didn't half like it, to judge by his chat. A discomforting hypothesis began to frame itself in his mind despite his efforts to stifle it. Here's the fellow, if there is one, who would know all these secret passages about here. Suppose there really is one leading out of that cave. He could have swarmed down the rope, got into the cave, sneaked up the subterranean passage, and got behind us that way. A fresh fact fitted suddenly in. And of course the other end of the passage may be in that fairy house. That would explain his being there. He'd be waiting to see us off the premises before he could venture out in his white costume. He pondered over the problem as he hurried with long strides towards the house. Well, he concluded, I'm taking no further steps in the business. It's no concern of mine to go probing into the private affairs of the family I'm going to marry into. And that's that. Then, as a fresh aspect of the matter came to his mind, he gave a sigh of relief. I must be a stricken idiot. No man would ever dream of burgling his own house. What would he gain by it, if he did? The thing's ridiculous. And the comfort which this view brought him was sufficient to lighten his steps for the rest of his way. Chapter 5. Sir Clinton in the Museum. There's the light on again in the museum, Sir Clinton observed. I think we'll go in and have a look round, now, to see if the place suggests anything. Mould stood aside to let them pass, and then resumed his watch at the door to prevent anyone else from entering the room. The servant had just finished fitting the new globe in its place and was preparing to remove the steps which he had used, when Sir Clinton ordered him to leave them in position and to await further instructions. The museum was a room about 40 feet square, with a lofty ceiling. To judge by the panelling of the walls, it belonged to the older part of Ravensthorpe, but the parquet of the floor seemed to be much more modern. Round the sides were placed exhibition cases about 6 feet high, and others of the same kind jutted out at intervals to form a series of shallow bays. In the center of the room, directly under the lamp, stood a long, flat-topped case, and the floor beside it was littered with broken glass. I think we'll begin at the beginning, said Sir Clinton. He turned to the servant who stood waiting beside the steps. Have you got the remains of the broken lamp there? You can go now, he added. We shan't need you further. When he had received the smashed lamp, he examined it. Not much to be made out of that, he admitted. It's been one of these 1,000 candle-power gas-filled things, and there's practically nothing left of it but the metal base and a few splinters of glass sticking to it. He looked up at the fresh lamp hanging above them. It's 30 feet or so above the floor. Nothing short of a fishing rod would reach it. Evidently they didn't smash it by hand. He stooped down and sorted out 1 or 2 small fragments of glass from the debris at his feet. These are more bits of the lamp, Joan, he said, holding them out for her to look at. You see the curve of the glass, and you'll notice that the whole affair seems to have been smashed almost to smithereens. There doesn't seem to be a decent-sized fragment in the whole lot. He turned to the keeper. I think we'll shut the door, Mould. We'd better conduct the rest of this business in private. The keeper closed the door of the museum, much to the disappointment of the group of people who had clustered about the entrance and were watching the proceedings with interest. Now, Joan, would you mind going round the wall cases and seeing if anything has been taken from them? Joan obediently paced round the room and soon came back to report that nothing seemed to have been removed. All the cases were locked, you know, she explained. And there's no glass broken in any of them. So far as I can see, nothing's missing from the shelves. What about that safe let into the wall over yonder? Sir Clinton inquired. It's used to house 1 or 2 extra valuable things from time to time, Joan explained. But tonight everything was put on show, and the safe's empty. She went over and swung the door open, showing the vacant shelves within. We do take precautions usually, she pointed out. The museum door itself is iron-plated and has a special lock. It was only tonight that we had everything out in the showcases. Sir Clinton refrained from comment, as he knew the girl was still blaming herself for her share in the catastrophe. He turned to examine the rifled section of the central case. What's missing here, Joan, can you make out? Obediently, Joan came to his side and ran her eye over the remaining articles in the compartment. They've taken the Medusa medallions, she exclaimed, turning pale as she realized the magnitude of the calamity. They've got the very pick of the collection, Sir Clinton. My father would have parted with all the rest rather than with these, I know. Nothing else gone. Joan looked again at the case. No, nothing else, so far as I can see. Wait a bit, though. They've taken the electrotype copies as well. There were 3 of each, 3 medallions and an electrotype from each that Foxton Polgate made for us. The whole 6 are gone. She cast a final glance at the compartment. No, there's nothing else missing, so far as I can see. Some of the things are displaced a bit, but everything except the medallions and the electros seems to be here. You're quite sure? Certain. Sir Clinton seemed satisfied. Of course we'll have to check the stuff by the catalogue to make sure, he said, but I expect you're right. The medallions alone would be quite a good enough haul for a minute or two's work, and probably they had their eyes on the things as the best paying proposition of the lot. But why did they take the electros as well? Joan demanded. Then a possible explanation occurred to her. Oh, of course, they wouldn't know which was which, so they took the lot in order to make sure. Possibly, Sir Clinton admitted. But don't let's be going too fast, Joan. We'd better not get ideas into our minds till we've got all the evidence, you know. Oh, I see, said Joan, with a faint return of her normal spirits. I'm to be Watson, am I? And you'll prove in a minute or two what an ass I've made of myself. Is that the idea? Not altogether, Sir Clinton returned, with a smile. But let's have the facts before the theories. He turned to the keeper. Now we'll take your story, Mould, but give us the things in the exact order in which they happened, if you can. And don't be worried if I break in with questions. Mould thought for a moment or two before beginning his tale. I'm trying to remember how many people there were in the room just before the lights went out, he explained at last. But somehow I don't quite seem able to put a figure on it, Sir Clinton. I've a sort of feeling that some of them must have got away before I stopped the door, sneaked off in the dark. At least I know I felt surprised when I saw how few I'd got left when they began to come up to me to be let out. But that's all I can really say, sir. Sir Clinton evidently approved of the keeper's caution. Now tell us exactly what happened when the light went out. This is the bit where I want you to be careful. Tell us everything you can remember. Mould fixed his eye on the corner of the room near the safe. I was pat-rolling round the room, sir, most of the night. I didn't stand in one place all the time. Now just when the light was about to go out, I was walking away from this case here. He nodded towards the rifled central case, and as near as may be, I got to the entrance to that second last bay, just before you come to the safe. I just turned round to come back, when I heard a pistol going off. That was the first thing that attracted your attention, questioned Sir Clinton. It's an important point, Mould. That was the first thing out o' the common that happened, Mould asserted. The pistol went bang, and out went the light, and I heard glass tinkling all over the place. Shot the light out, did they? Sir Clinton mused. He glanced up at the carved wooden ceiling, but evidently failed to find what he was looking for. Have you a pair of race glasses, Joan? Prismatics, or even opera glasses? Tell Mould where he can get them, please. Joan gave the keeper instructions and he left the room. Knock when you come back again, Sir Clinton ordered. I'm going to lock the door to keep out the inquisitive. As soon as the keeper was out of earshot, Sir Clinton turned to Joan. This fellow Mould, is he a reliable man? Do you know anything about him, Joan? He's our head keeper. We've always trusted him completely. She glanced at Sir Clinton, trying to read the expression on his face. You don't think he's at the bottom of the business, do you? I never thought of that. I'm only collecting facts at present. All I want to know is whether you know Mould to be reliable. We've always found him so. Good. We'll make a note of that, and if we get the thing cleared up, then we'll perhaps be able to confirm that opinion of yours. In a few minutes a knock came at the door and Sir Clinton admitted the keeper. Prismatics, he said, taking the glasses from Mould. They'll do quite well. Adjusting the focus, he subjected the ceiling of the room to a minute scrutiny. At last he handed the glasses to Joan. Look up there, he said, indicating the position. Joan swept the place with the glasses for a moment. I see, she said. That's a bullet hole in the wood, isn't it? Sir Clinton confirmed her guess. That's evidently where the bullet went after knocking the lamp to pieces. Pull the steps over there, Mould. I want to have a closer look at the thing. With some difficulty, owing to his injured ankle, he ascended the steps and inspected the tiny cavity. It looks like a .22 caliber. One could carry a Colt pistol of that size in one's pocket and no one would notice it. His eye traced out the line joining the bullet mark and the lamp. The shot was evidently fired by someone in that bay over there, he inferred. Just go to where you were standing when the light went out, Mould. Can you see into this bay here? Mould looked around and discovered that a showcase interposed between him and the point from which the pistol had been fired. They evidently thought of everything, Sir Clinton said, when he heard Mould's report. If a man had brandished his pistol in front of Mould, there was always a chance that Mould might have remembered his costume. Firing from that hiding place, he was quite safe, and could take time over his aim if he wanted to. He climbed down the steps and verified the matter by going to the position from which the shot had been fired. It was evident that the shooter was out of sight of the keeper at the actual moment of the discharge. Now what happened after that? Mould? Sir Clinton demanded, coming back to the central case again. Mould scratched his ear as though reflecting, then hurriedly took his hand down again. This pistol went off, sir, and the lamp glass tinkled all over the place. I got a start, who wouldn't, with the light going out, and all. Before I could move an inch, someone got a grip of my wrists and swung me round. He twisted my arms behind my back and I couldn't do anything but kick, and not much kicking even, or I'd have gone down on my face. Did you manage to get home on him at all? I think I kicked him once, sir, but it was only a graze. Pity, Sir Clinton said. It would have always been something gained if you'd marked him with a good bruise. Oh, there'll be a mark, if that's all you want, sir. But it wouldn't prevent him running at all. And then? Sir Clinton brought Mould back to his story. Then, almost at once when the lights went out, I heard glass break in, just as if you'd heaved a stone through a window. It seemed to me, but I couldn't take my oath on it, as if there was two smashes, one after t'other. I couldn't be sure. Then there was a lot of scuffling in the dark, but who did it, I couldn't rightly say. I was busy trying to get free from the man who was holding me then. Sir Clinton moved over to the rifled compartment and inspected the broken glass thoughtfully for a moment or two. Are you looking for finger marks? Asked Joan, as she came to his side. Sir Clinton shook his head. Not much use hunting for finger marks round here. Remember how many people must have leaned on this case at one time or other during the evening, when they were looking at the collection before the robbery. Fingerprints would prove nothing against anyone in particular, I'm afraid, Joan. What I'm really trying to find is some evidence confirming Mould's notion that he heard two smashes after the light went out. It certainly looks as if he were right. If you look at the way that bit of glass there is cracked, you'll see two series of lines in it. It might have been cracked here, he pointed with his finger. First of all, long cracks radiating from a smash over in this direction. Then there was a second blow, about here, which snapped off the apices of the spears of glass left after the first smash. But that really proves nothing. The same man might easily have hit the pane twice. He turned back to the keeper. Can you give me an estimate, Mould, of how long it was between the two crashes you heard? Mould considered carefully before replying. So far as I can remember, Sir Clinton, it was about 5 seconds. But I'll not take my oath on it. I wish you could be surer, said the chief constable. If it really was 5 seconds, it certainly looks like two separate affairs. A man smashing glass with repeated blows wouldn't wait 5 seconds between them. He scanned the broken glass again. There's a lot of jagged stuff round the edge of the hole but no blood, so far as I can see. The fellow must have worn a thick glove if he got his hand in there in the dark without cutting himself in the hurry. He turned back to the keeper. You can go outside, Mould, and keep people off the doorstep for a minute or two. Perhaps we shall have news of the manhunt soon. If anyone wants to see me on business, let him in, but keep off casual inquirers for the present. Obediently Mould unlocked the door and took his stand on the threshold outside, shutting the door behind him as he went. When he had gone, Sir Clinton turned to Joan. Were these medallions insured, do you know? Fortunately, Joan was able to supply some information. Maurice insured them, I know. But I've heard him say that he wasn't content with the valuation put on them by the company. It seems they wouldn't take his word for the value of the things. They thought it was a speculative one or something, and in case of a loss they weren't prepared to go beyond a figure which Maurice thought too small. The electros weren't insured for any great amount, I suppose. Joan shook her head. I don't think they were specially insured. They were just put under the ordinary house policy, I think. But you'd better ask Maurice. He knows all about it. Sir Clinton glanced round the room once more. I doubt if there's much more to find out here, he concluded. It doesn't give us much to go on, does it? Perhaps we'll have better luck when these fellows come in from their hunt. They may have some news for us. But as things stand, we can't even be sure whether it was two men or two gangs that were at work. One can't blame Mould for not giving us better information, but what he gave us doesn't seem to amount to very much at present. He turned, as though to leave the room, but at that moment the door opened and Mould appeared. There's a Mr. Foss wants to see you, sir. He says he's got something to tell you that won't wait. He's been looking for you all over the house. That's the American, isn't it? Sir Clinton asked Joan in a low voice. Yes. He's been here for a day or two, consulting with Maurice about these medallions. Well, if he can throw any light on this business, I suppose we'd better let him in and see what he has to say. You needn't go, Joan. You may as well hear his story, whatever it may be. He turned to the keeper. Let Mr. Foss in, Mould, and wait outside the door yourself. Chapter 6. Mr. Foss's explanation. Mr. Foss had nothing distinctively American in his appearance, Sir Clinton noted, and when he spoke, his accent was so faint as to be hardly detectable. He was a stout man of about 50, with a clean-shaven face and more than a trace of a double chin, the kind of man who might readily be chosen as an unofficial uncle by children. Sir Clinton's first glance showed him that the American was troubled about something. Foss seemed surprised to find the chief constable in the guise of Prospero. He himself, in preparation for an official interview, had exchanged his masquerade costume for ordinary evening clothes. We haven't met before, Sir Clinton, he explained, rather unnecessarily, but I've something to tell you, his face clouded slightly, which I felt you ought to know before you go any further in this business. I've been hunting all over the house for you, and it was only a minute or two ago that I got directed in here. Yes, said Sir Clinton, interrogatively. Foss glanced at Joan and seemed to find some difficulty in opening the subject. It's a strictly private matter, he explained. Joan refused to take the implied hint. If it has any connection with this burglary, Mr. Foss, I see no reason why I should not hear what you have to say. It's a matter that concerns me as one of the family, you know. Foss seemed taken aback, and quite evidently he would have preferred to make his confidence to Sir Clinton alone. It's rather a difficult matter, he said, with a feeble endeavour to deflect Joan from her purpose. Joan, however, took no notice of his diffidence. Come, Mr. Foss, she said. If it's really important, the sooner Sir Clinton hears of it the better. Begin. Foss glanced appealingly at Sir Clinton, but apparently the chief constable took Joan's view of the matter. I'm rather busy at present, Mr. Foss, he said, dryly. Perhaps you'll give us your information as concisely as possible. Having failed in his attempt, Foss made the best of it, though it was with obvious reluctance that he launched into his subject. Last night after dinner, he began, I went into the Winter Garden to smoke a cigar. I had some business affairs which I wanted to put straight in my mind, and I thought I could stow myself away in a corner there and be free from interruption. So I sat down at one side of the Winter Garden behind a large clump of palms where no one was likely to see me, and I began to think over the points I had in mind. Yes, prompted Sir Clinton, who seemed anxious to cut Foss's narrative down to essentials. While I was sitting there, the American continued, some of the young people came into the Winter Garden and sat down in a recess on the side opposite to where I was. At first they didn't disturb me. I thought they'd be almost out of earshot, on the other side of the dome. I think you were one of them, Miss Chasewater, you, and your brother, and Miss Rainhill, and someone else whom I didn't recognize. I was there, Joan confirmed, looking rather puzzled as to what might come next. You may not know, Miss Chasewater, Foss continued, that your Winter Garden is a sort of whispering gallery. Although I was quite a long way off from your party, your voices came quite clearly across to where I was sitting. They didn't disturb me at all. I've got the knack of concentration when I'm thinking about business affairs. But although I wasn't listening intentionally, the whole conversation was getting in at my ear while I was thinking about other things. I suppose I ought to have gone away or let you know I was there. But the fact is, I just got to a point where I was seeing my way through a rather knotty tangle, and I didn't want to break my chain of thought. I wasn't eavesdropping, you understand. Yes, repeated Sir Clinton, with a slight acidity in his tone. And then. But the American failed to take the hint. Evidently, he laid great stress on explaining exactly how things had fallen out. After a while, he went on, with an evident effort to be accurate, Miss Chasewater and someone else left the party. Quite true, Joan confirmed. We went to play billiards. The American nodded. When you had gone, he continued, someone else joined the party, a red-haired young man whom they called Foxy. Sir Clinton glanced at Joan. That's Foxton Polegate, Joan explained. He's a neighbour of ours. He made these electrotypes of the medallions for us. Foss waited patiently till she had finished her interjection. Then he resumed his narrative. Shortly after that, my ear caught the sound of my own name. Naturally my attention was attracted, quite without any intention on my part. It's only natural to prick up your ears when you hear your own name mentioned. He looked apologetically at them both as if asking them to condone his conduct. The next thing I heard, without listening intentionally, you understand, was Medusa medallions. Now, as you know, I've been sent over here by Mr. Keswick to see if I can arrange to buy these medallions from Mr. Chasewater. It's my duty to my employer to get to know all I can about them. I wouldn't be earning my money if I spared any trouble in the work which has been put into my hands. So when I heard the name of the medallions mentioned, frankly, I listened with both ears. It seemed to me my duty to Mr. Keswick to do so. He looked appealingly at their faces as though to plead for a favorable verdict on his conduct. Go on, please, Sir Clinton requested. I hardly expected you'd look on it as I do, Foss confessed rather shamefacedly. Of course, it was just plain eavesdropping on my part by that time. But I felt Mr. Keswick would have expected me to find out all I could about these medallions. To be candid, I'd do the same again, though I didn't like doing it. Sir Clinton seemed to feel that he had been rather discouraging. I shouldn't make too much of it, Mr. Foss. What happened next? Foss's face showed that he was at last coming to a matter of real difficulty. It's rather unfortunate that I came to be mixed up in the thing at all, he said, with obvious chagrin. I can assure you, Miss Chasewater, that I don't like doing it. I only made up my mind to tell you about it because it seems to me to give a chance of hushing this supposed burglary up quietly before there's any talk goes round. Supposed burglary, exclaimed Joan. What's your idea of a real burglary, if this sort of thing is only a supposed one? She indicated the shattered showcase and the litter of glass on the floor. Foss evidently decided to take the rest of his narrative in a rush. I'll tell you, he said. The next thing I overheard was a complete plan for a fake burglary, a practical joke, to be carried out tonight. The light in here was to be put out, the house lights were to be extinguished, and in the darkness, your brother and this Mr. Foxy how-do-you-call-him were to get away with the medallions. Ah, Mr. Foss, now you become interesting, Sir Clinton acknowledged. I heard all the details, Foss went on. How Miss Rainhill was to see to extinguishing the lights, how Mr. Chasewater was to secure the keeper, and how meanwhile his friend was to put on a thick glove and take the medallions out of the case there. And it seems to me that it was a matter that interested me directly, he added, dropping his air of apology. For I gathered that the whole affair was planned with some idea of making this sale to Mr. Keswick fall through at the last moment. Indeed. Sir Clinton's face showed that at last he saw something more clearly than before. That was the motive, Foss continued. Now the whole thing put me in a most awkward position. I think I see your difficulty, Sir Clinton assured him, with more geniality than he had hitherto shown. It was very hard to make up my mind what to do, Foss went on. I'm a guest here. This was a family joke, apparently, one brother taking a rise out of another. It was hardly for me to step in and perhaps cause bad feelings between them. I thought the whole thing was perhaps just talk, not meant seriously in the end. A kind of how would we do it if we set about it discussion, you understand. Sir Clinton nodded understandingly. Difficult to know what to do, in your shoes, undoubtedly. Foss was obviously relieved by the Chief Constable's comprehension. I thought it over, he continued, with a less defensive tone in his voice, and it seemed to me that the soundest course was to let sleeping dogs lie, to let them lie, at any rate, until they woke up and bit somebody. I made up my mind I'd say nothing about the matter at all, unless something really did happen. Very judicious, Sir Clinton acquiesced. Then came tonight, Foss resumed. Their plan went through. I don't know what success they had, the house is full of all sorts of rumours. But I heard that the Chief Constable was on the spot and was taking up the case himself, and as soon as I heard that, I felt I ought to tell what I knew. So I hunted you out, so as to avoid your taking any steps before you knew just how the land lay. It's only a practical joke and not a crime at all. I don't know anything about your English laws, and I was afraid you might be taking some steps, doing something or other that would make it impossible to stop short of the whole affair coming out in public. I'm sure the family wouldn't like that. He glanced at Joan's face, but evidently found nothing very encouraging in her expression. It's been a most unfortunate position for me, he complained. Sir Clinton took pity on him. It was very good of you to give me these facts, he said with more cordiality than he had hitherto shown. You've cleared up the thing and saved us from putting our foot in it badly, perhaps. Thanks very much for your trouble, Mr. Foss. You've been of great assistance. His tone showed that the interview was at an end, but, tactfully, as though to spare the obviously ruffled feelings of the American, he accompanied him to the door. When Foss had left the room, Sir Clinton turned back to Joan. "Well, Joan, what about it?" "Oh, it sounds accurate enough," Joan admitted, though there was an undercurrent of resentment in her tone. "Foss couldn't have known what sort of person Foxy is, and it's as clear as daylight that Foxy was at the bottom of this. He's a silly ass who's always playing practical jokes." She paused for a moment. Then relief showed itself in her voice as she added, "It's rather a blessing to know the whole affair has been just spoof, isn't it? You can hush it up easily enough, can't you? Nobody need know exactly what happened, and then we'll be all right. If this story comes out, all our little family bickerings will be common talk, and one doesn't want that. I'm not exactly proud of the way Maurice has been treating Cecil." Sir Clinton's face showed that he understood her position, but, rather to her surprise, he gave no verbal assurance. "It is all right," she demanded. "I think we'll interview your friend Foxy first of all," Sir Clinton proposed, taking no notice of her inquiry. Going to the door, he gave some orders to the keeper. "You were rather stiff with our good Mr. Foss," he said, turning to Joan as he closed the door again. "What would you have done yourself, if you'd been in his position?" Joan had her answer ready. "I suppose he couldn't help overhearing things, but when this affair came to light, I think if I'd been in his shoes I'd have gone to Cecil instead of coming to us with the tale. Once Cecil found the game was up, he'd have been able to return the medallions in some way or other, without raising any dust. That was one way, certainly. What I object to is Foss coming to you," Joan explained. "He didn't know you're an old friend of ours. All he knew was that you were the chief constable. So off he hies to you, post-haste, to give the whole show away, when he might quite well have come to me or gone to Cecil. I don't like this way of doing things, no tact at all." "I can't conceive how Cecil came to take up a silly prank like this," said Sir Clinton. "It's a schoolboy's trick." "You don't know everything," said Joan, in defense of her brother. "I know a good deal, Joan," Sir Clinton retorted in a decisive tone. "Perhaps I know more than you think about this business." In a few minutes the keeper knocked at the door. "Well," demanded Sir Clinton, opening it. "I can't find Mr. Polgate anywhere, sir," Mould reported. "No one's seen him, and he's not in the house." "He was here tonight," Joan declared. "I recognized him when I was dancing with him. You can't mistake that shock of hair, and of course his voice gave him away when he spoke." Sir Clinton did not seem perturbed. "Bring Mr. Cecil, Mould," he ordered, and locked the door again as the keeper went off on his fresh errand. This task Mould completed in a very short time. Sir Clinton opened at his knock and Cecil Chasewater came into the museum. He was dressed as a Swiss admiral and behind him came Una Rainhill in the costume of Cleopatra. Sir Clinton wasted no time in preliminaries. "I've sent for you, Cecil, because I want to know exactly what part you played in this business tonight." Cecil Chasewater opened his eyes in astonishment. "You seem to be a bit of a super sleuth. How did you spot us so quickly?" Quite obviously Cecil was not greatly perturbed at being found out, as Sir Clinton noted with a certain relief. So far as he was concerned, the thing had been only a prank. "Tell me exactly what happened after you came in here before the lights went out," the chief constable demanded in a curt tone. Cecil glanced at Una. Sir Clinton caught the look. "We know all about Miss Rainhill's part in the affair," he explained bluntly. "Oh, in that case," said Cecil, "there's no particular reason why I should keep back anything. Una, Foxy, and I planned it between us. I take full responsibility for that. I wanted to upset this sale, if I could. I'm not ashamed of that." "I know all about that," Sir Clinton pointed out, coldly. "What I wish to know is exactly what happened after you came in here to steal these medallions." Cecil seemed impressed by the chief constable's tone. "I'll tell you, then. We've nothing to conceal. I came in here at about 20 to 12 and sauntered about the room, pretending to look at the cases as if I'd never seen them before. My part was to mark down Mould and prevent him interfering." Sir Clinton nodded to show that he knew all this. "Rather before I expected it, the light went out." "Oh, there was a shot fired just then. I didn't understand that part of it, but I supposed that Foxy had brought a pistol with him and fired a blank cartridge just to add a touch of interest to the affair. It wasn't on the bill of fare, so I imagine it must have been one of these last-minute improvements. Anyhow, I did my part of the business, jumped on Mould and held him while Foxy got away with the stuff. Then, when he'd had time to get away, I let Mould go and made a beeline for the door myself. I could swear no one spotted me in the dark, and I was well mixed up in the mob before the lights went on again. Did you pay particular attention to what Polegate was doing while you were busy with the keeper? No. Mold gave me all I wanted in the way of trouble. You're sure it was Mold you got hold of? You didn't make any mistake. Cecil reflected for a moment. I don't see how I could have gripped the wrong man. I'd marked him down while the light was on. Can you remember anything about sounds of breaking glass? Cecil pondered before replying. It seemed to me that there was a lot of glass breaking, more than I'd expected. The light was hardly out before there was a smash and tinkle all over the place. Foxy must have got to work quicker than I'd allowed for. And I remember hearing quite a lot of hammering and smashing going on after that, as if he'd found it difficult to make a big enough hole in the glass of the case. I thought he'd bungled the business, and it was all I could do to keep my grip on Mold long enough to get the thing safely through. Sir Clinton dismissed that part of the subject. He turned to Una. Now, Miss Rainhill, I believe your part in the affair was to pull out the main switch of the house. Yes, Una admitted, looking rather surprised at the extent of his knowledge. Did you carry out your part of the arrangement punctually, or were you late in getting the current off? I pulled out the switch to the very second. I had my hand on it and my eye on my wristwatch, and when it came to 11.45 I jerked it out and the lights went off. I was absolutely right to a second, I'm sure. And you thought Miss Rainhill had been a shade before her time, Cecil? So it seemed to me. I hadn't a chance of looking at my watch, and of course after the lights went off I couldn't spare time to look. At this moment another knock came to the door and Foxy Polegate burst into the museum. Sir Clinton noticed that he was masquerading as a harlequin. Heard you been asking for me, Sir Clinton, he broke out as he came into the room. Seems the keeper had been inquiring for me. So I came along as soon as I heard about it. He glanced inquisitively at Cecil and Una, as though wondering what they were doing there. Sir Clinton wasted no words. The medallions, Mr. Polegate, please. Foxy made a very good pretense of astonishment at the demand, but Cecil cut him short. You may as well hand them over, Foxy. They seem to know all about the joke. Oh, they do they? Foxy exclaimed. They seem to have been mighty swift about it. That little joke's gone astray, evidently. He seemed completely taken aback by the exposure. The medallions, he repeated. I'll get 'em for you in a jiffy. He walked across to the showcase, fumbled for a moment at the flat base near one of the legs, and from below this he drew out 3 medallions. Stuck 'em there with plasticine as soon as I'd got 'em. After that any one would have turned out my pockets if they'd wanted. See. Sir Clinton held out his hand and took the medallions from Foxy. For a moment or two he examined them, then he passed them to Cecil. Have you any way of telling easily whether these are the real things or the replicas? Cecil inspected them one by one with minute care. These are the real things, he announced. What else could they be? You've no doubt about it? Questioned Sir Clinton. Not a bit, Cecil assured him. When Foxy made the replicas, my father had a tiny hole, just a dot, drilled in the edge of each electrotype so as to distinguish the real things from the sham. There are no holes here, so these are the real Leonardos. Sir Clinton swung round suddenly on Foxy. Now, Mr. Polegate, he said, sternly, you've given a lot of trouble with this silly joke of yours. I'm not concerned with your taste in humor, or I might say a few things you wouldn't care to hear. But you can repair the damage to some extent if you give me a frank account of your doings in here tonight. I want the whole story, please. Foxy was evidently completely taken aback by Sir Clinton's tone. Come, we're waiting. There's no time to lose, Sir Clinton said, curtly, as Foxy seemed to hesitate. Joan and the others showed by their faces that they could not quite understand the reason for the Chief Constable's asperity. We planned that. I know all about that, said Sir Clinton, brusquely. Begin at the point where you came in here at 20 to 12 or so. Foxy pulled himself together. The Chief Constable's manner was not encouraging. I came in here as arranged, and worked my way over to the central case there, slowly, so as not to attract the keeper's attention. 1 or 2 other people were hanging round it then, too. I remember noticing a chap in a white Pierrot costume alongside me. Suddenly there was a pistol shot and the light went out according to plan. How do you account for the pistol shot? Demanded Sir Clinton. Try next door, said Foxy. I thought it was a fancy tip that Cecil had thrown in at the last moment. It wasn't in the book of words. You were ready to get to work when the light went out? Inquired Sir Clinton. Foxy considered for a moment. It took me rather by surprise, he admitted. I'd counted on having at least another minute, according to the timetable. What happened next? Be careful now.